Is Israel a terrorist state? It's a question that ignites passions, sparks fierce debate, and forces us to confront some of the most complex moral and political dilemmas of our time. This isn't a simple yes or no answer. It's a question loaded with history, pain, and deeply held beliefs. This question is one of the most divisive in modern international politics. It cuts across national boundaries, ideological divides, and cultural differences, leaving few neutral observers in its wake. The very act of asking the question can be seen as an act of aggression by some, while others view it as a necessary challenge to the status quo. For some, the answer is a clear yes, a resounding affirmation based on what they perceive as a pattern of state-sponsored violence and oppression. Citing decades of conflict, a seemingly endless cycle of violence that has claimed countless lives and left a legacy of trauma and resentment. Occupation, the ongoing control of Palestinian territories viewed by many as a violation of international law and a fundamental obstacle to peace. And military actions that have left many civilian casualties. The images of suffering, particularly among women and children, fuel the outrage and solidify the conviction that Israel's actions constitute terrorism. They see a powerful state using military might to oppress another people, wielding its superior firepower with impunity and disregarding the human cost of its operations. Employing tactics they argue are indistinguishable from terrorism. The intentional targeting of civilian infrastructure, the use of disproportionate force, and the collective punishment of entire communities are all cited as evidence of this alleged state-sponsored terrorism. On the other side, a different narrative emerges, one that emphasizes the unique challenges and threats faced by the State of Israel. Supporters of Israel see a nation born from persecution, a refuge for a people who have endured centuries of anti-Semitism and genocide, defending itself against existential threats. They point to the constant barrage of rocket attacks, the suicide bombings, and the unwavering hostility of neighboring countries as justification for its military actions. For them, Israel's military actions are defensive measures, a necessary response to protect its citizens from harm and to safeguard its very existence, to protect its people from terrorist groups. They argue that Hamas and other militant organizations deliberately target civilians and use them as human shields, making it impossible for Israel to avoid civilian casualties altogether. The debate is not just academic, it has real-world consequences that affect millions of lives. It shapes foreign policy, influencing the decisions of governments around the world and determining the level of international support that Israel receives. Aid, dictating the flow of resources to both Israelis and Palestinians, and impacting the humanitarian situation on the ground, and the prospects for peace. It creates obstacles to dialogue and reconciliation, making it harder to find common ground and to build a future where both Israelis and Palestinians can live in security and dignity. To understand this controversy, to navigate the complexities and the contradictions, we must first examine what the word terrorism really means. We need to unpack its definition, explore its historical context, and understand how it is applied and misapplied in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Before we even consider labeling any country as a sponsor or perpetrator of terrorism, a label that carries immense weight and consequence, we must first grapple with the fundamental challenge of defining terrorism itself. What exactly does this term mean? What actions qualify and what are the nuances that separate it from other forms of violence or conflict? Generally, in its most widely understood sense, terrorism is the calculated use of intentional violence, often spectacular and shocking, against civilian populations. The purpose? To instill fear, to coerce, and ultimately to achieve specific political or ideological goals. It's about creating an atmosphere of terror to force change. However, the crucial point is the lack of a universally agreed-upon legal definition of terrorism under international law. This absence creates a significant problem. It means the term is often used selectively, sometimes strategically, and even manipulatively, as a political tool to delegitimize opponents or justify certain actions. As the saying goes, one nation's terrorist is another's freedom fighter. What one group considers a legitimate act of resistance, another may condemn as a heinous act of terror. This inherent subjectivity in labeling actions and actors makes the term deeply contested and highly sensitive, fueling endless debates and disagreements. Furthermore, when the label terrorist is applied to a state, the accusation directly questions the very legitimacy of its use of force, its right to defend itself, and its standing in the international community. Critics vehemently argue that any act of targeting civilians with the intent to create fear and panic unequivocally constitutes terrorism, regardless of the identity of the perpetrator, whether it's a non-state actor or a government. However, defenders of state actions maintain that state militaries, which are expected to operate under established rules of engagement and international humanitarian law, cannot be fairly equated with clandestine, non-state groups that deliberately target civilians outside of any legal framework. Therefore, understanding the nuances and complexities of the definition itself is the first and perhaps most crucial battleground in this ongoing debate about terrorism. Critics who call Israel a terrorist state point to specific actions and policies. They cite high Palestinian civilian casualties in military operations, especially in Gaza, as evidence of collective punishment. The use of disproportionate force, such as airstrikes in response to rocket fire, is seen as punitive and designed to break the will of the population. Settler violence in the West Bank, often under military protection, is described as systematic intimidation to displace Palestinians. Tactics like targeted assassinations, administrative detention, and home demolitions are viewed as psychological terror. Critics argue these elements form a pattern of state-sponsored terrorism. For them, the evidence is clear and damning. Supporters of Israel reject the terrorist label, seeing it as a distortion of reality. They argue Israel is a sovereign nation with a right to defend its citizens from groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. The IDF, they say, does not intentionally target civilians and take steps to minimize harm, such as warning strikes. Civilian casualties are seen as tragic but unavoidable when enemies operate from civilian areas. Disproportionate force, in their view, is necessary to restore deterrence and prevent future attacks. They argue that labeling Israel as terrorist is a political tactic to delegitimize the state. For them, the distinction between state defense and terrorism is clear and absolute. The Gaza Strip, a narrow coastal territory, is central to the Israeli-Palestinian debate. Its unique geography and complex history have made it a focal point of contention. Understanding the situation in Gaza requires acknowledging the intense pressures and challenges faced by its inhabitants. The situation in Gaza is seen by critics as an example of collective punishment and state terror, a perspective that highlights the severe impact of Israeli policies on the civilian population. These critics argue that the measures imposed on Gaza disproportionately affect ordinary people, leading to a deterioration of living conditions and a sense of hopelessness. The blockade, imposed since 2007, has become a defining feature of life in Gaza. It's a complex system of restrictions that has far-reaching consequences for the people living there. This blockade restricts the movement of people and goods in and out of the territory, severely impacting the economy and daily life. The flow of essential supplies, including medicine and building materials, is tightly controlled, leading to shortages and hardship. The restrictions imposed by the blockade have contributed to a humanitarian crisis for over 2 million people living in Gaza. The high population density, combined with limited resources and restricted movement, creates immense challenges for the population. Repeated military operations in Gaza have resulted in the destruction of vital civilian infrastructure, including homes, schools, and hospitals. This damage further exacerbates the already dire living conditions and hinders the ability of the population to rebuild their lives. These military actions have also caused high death tolls, with a significant number of civilian casualties. The impact on the healthcare system is immense, as medical facilities struggle to cope with the influx of injured and traumatized individuals. Critics argue that the scale of destruction and the high number of civilian casualties are evidence of indiscriminate attacks by the Israeli military. They point to the targeting of residential areas and the use of heavy weaponry in densely populated urban environments. However, Israel and its supporters argue that the blockade is a necessary security measure to protect its citizens from attacks emanating from Gaza. They maintain that the restrictions are aimed at preventing Hamas, the governing authority in Gaza, from acquiring weapons and building up its military capabilities. Israel asserts that the blockade is essential to prevent Hamas from importing weapons and materials used to construct rockets and other offensive weapons. They claim that these weapons are then used to target Israeli civilians, justifying the need for continued restrictions. Israel also claims that its military actions are carefully targeted at legitimate military threats, such as rocket launchers and weapons depots. They emphasize the use of precision strikes and other measures to minimize civilian casualties. They further argue that civilian casualties are a tragic consequence of Hamas embedding itself among the civilian population, using homes, schools, and hospitals as cover for its military activities. This tactic, they claim, makes it difficult to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Israel frequently points to evidence of tunnels dug under residential areas and rocket launch sites located within civilian neighborhoods. This evidence, they argue, demonstrates Hamas's deliberate strategy of using civilians as human shields. Therefore, the Israeli government argues that the ultimate responsibility for the civilian suffering in Gaza lies with Hamas, which they accuse of prioritizing its own political and military objectives over the well-being of the population. In conclusion, the narratives surrounding Gaza are starkly opposed, with each side blaming the other for the ongoing tragedy. The conflicting perspectives highlight the deep-seated divisions and the complex challenges in finding a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The West Bank raises further accusations of state terrorism through settlement expansion and military control. Critics argue settlements are illegal, enforced by land confiscation, home demolitions, and a two-tiered legal system. Daily life for Palestinians is marked by checkpoints, night raids, and restricted movement, creating an atmosphere of fear. Israel and its supporters see settlements as a return to ancestral land and a security necessity. Military presence is framed as counter-terrorism, with checkpoints and raids aimed at preventing attacks. The IDF is seen as maintaining order, not terrorizing the population. Competing narratives persist, each rooted in different interpretations of law, history, and security. The international community is deeply divided on Israel's actions. The UN has passed numerous resolutions condemning Israel's occupation and military conduct, but enforcement is limited. The US often shields Israel from sanctions, reflecting geopolitical alliances. European nations criticize settlements but maintain relations. Arab and Muslim countries label Israel an aggressor. Human rights organizations have accused Israel of apartheid, arguing systemic oppression of Palestinians. Israel dismisses these reports as biased, but they influence global discourse. The term apartheid is distinct from terrorism, but both are grave accusations. International opinion remains fractured with no consensus. Israel's actions are shaped by a security doctrine rooted in history and survival. The trauma of the Holocaust and wars with neighbors have forged a security-first mindset. Deterrence is key. Israel responds to attacks with overwhelming force to prevent future threats. Defensible borders justify control over territories like the West Bank and Golan Heights. Settlements are seen as both ideological and strategic. Israel distinguishes between fighting conventional armies and non-state actors like Hamas, who use civilian cover. The government argues its tactics are responses to existential threats, not aggression. Difficult choices, they say, are forced by the nature of their adversaries. The question of whether Israel is a terrorist state remains deeply contested. Critics highlight Palestinian suffering, occupation, and policies they say are designed to instill fear. Supporters emphasize Israel's right to self-defense against groups using terrorist tactics. The international community offers no clear verdict, reflecting political divisions and selective application of law. Both narratives contain elements of truth, shaped by lived realities and historical trauma. The pain on both sides is real, and the conflict defies simple labels. Understanding requires listening, empathy, and a commitment to shared humanity. The path forward lies not in labels, but in the pursuit of a just and lasting peace.